Today, I want to start with a question. What are you afraid of? Some people are afraid of spiders or heights. One of my kids is afraid of driving through tunnels. How about you? What are you afraid of? I ask because humans are not very good at threat assessment. In 1975, the blockbuster Jaws focused on the common fear of being attacked by a shark while swimming. How many of you have ever scanned the water for a dorsal fin before stepping in at the local pool? Admittedly, being bit by a shark would be awful. But it hardly ever happens. Worldwide, fewer than 8 people per year are killed by sharks. To put that in perspective, in America alone, over 43,000 people are injured by toilets each year. And many more Americans drown each day than are killed by sharks in a year. We worry about sharks when waves are actually what's dangerous. Likewise, when I grew up in the 70s during the Cold War, we were very afraid of nuclear bombs that could kill millions of us. So while we regularly practiced drills in which we hid under our desks, we were ignoring the less dramatic dangers that have killed millions of us. Diabetes, heart disease, drug use, and suicide. We were so focused on the Russians that we weren't paying attention to the far more pressing threats. And I share this because these days, I experience our society to be more fearful than ever. We're afraid of China, Russia, and Iran. We're afraid of inflation and illegal immigration. We're afraid of 4 more years of Biden or 4 more years of Trump. We're afraid of spy balloons over Montana and ISIS cells that may be infiltrating the United States. Increasingly, we're afraid of civil war. Now, any of those things could be awful, I admit. But they may be what's distracting us from what's a far bigger threat, which isn't what's happening around us or might happen to us. It's what's happening inside us. And I'm not talking about cancer or your genes either. For most of us, far more dangerous than what's happening in our cells is what's lurking in our souls. It's what's lurking in my soul too. News outlets and social media keep tickling my limbic system with daily doses of fear by blasting outrageous statements from that politician I don't like or dire economic predictions from some unknown pundit. Like a car driving too long past a red line, a lot of us are burning out from having our anxiety run too hot for too long. More importantly, my attention is distracted from the threats that are far more likely to harm me. My pride, my insecurity, my anger, lust or loneliness, my constant doom scrolling that causes me to neglect my body, my family, my spouse, or my soul. Will you get hurt by a terrorist attack? It could happen, but not likely. Will you get hurt because your unconfessed sin and untreated trauma from the past will ruin your relationships with God and other people? Almost definitely. A year ago, as we were planning this year's sermons, we scheduled a post-Easter series on the spirituality of politics to prepare us for the contentious presidential election ahead. We're still going to do that, but given the current crisis of emotional health in our country, which we expect to be exacerbated as we approach this November's elections, we realize that many of us are unable to engage politics in a healthy way. Our chaotic emotions are so easily hijacked that it becomes impossible to have constructive conversations. I'm not just talking about you. It's me, too. So this week, we're starting a sermon series called Deep, in which we'll explore emotionally healthy spirituality. The emphasis since the Enlightenment has been on intellectually robust Christianity, and we've benefited in many ways from the fruit that came from that pursuit. But something essential has been neglected along the way. Almost 30 years ago, the pastor of a thriving megachurch in New York started noticing how spiritually shallow even some of his most faithful parishioners were. They attended Bible studies and prayer meetings, but they were immature in the ways they dealt with conflict and pain. They could explain what the Bible says about forgiveness and love, but unaddressed anger, trauma, sin, and fear kept them from experiencing forgiveness and love or extending it. And then he noticed it in his pastoral staff, who could preach powerfully, but were manipulative and deceptive in their personal lives. And only after stewing on this for a while did he recognize those same things in himself. For years, he'd been acting happy and holy in public while stuffing his true emotions, his rage, grief, and fear, so deep that no one could see it. He was acting in ways that would please people and meet expectations, but deep inside, he was miserable, anxious, angry, and lonely. He realized that we can't be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. So Pastor Peter Scazzero made it his mission to experience and to invite others to experience a kind of spirituality that goes deeper than doctrines, moves beyond our brains deep into our souls, which is captured in his books about emotionally healthy spirituality. Now, I know that to some of you, even the idea of emotionally healthy spirituality sounds silly and self-helpy. But over the past 15 years, I've discovered personally how transformative it can be. When I first discovered these insights, I'd already graduated from seminary. I knew theology, history, Hebrew, and Greek, but I didn't know my own heart. I couldn't see my own motives, anxieties, or history that were controlling me. At the core, Christianity is about love from God, love for God, and loving like God. But all the things I couldn't see inside myself prevented me from truly loving God with my whole mind, heart, soul, and strength, or experiencing his love. So I couldn't love others the way I wanted to either. I didn't have the words for it back then, but sadly, before I even got into ministry, I discovered the devastating cost of being spiritually shallow, which has been one of my greatest fears ever since. I began exploring faith in a serious way as a teenager when I started attending a large church that was built around the charisma of our senior pastor. He was revered like a rock star. We watched perform on stage each Sunday, and he relished our admiration. His face graced national magazines. His books were bestsellers. He spoke to important people in politics, business, and sports whose names he dropped with the perfect degree of indifference to suggest he just spent way too much time in those elite circles to be impressed anymore. What was even more special was that although there were thousands of members in our church who wanted his attention, and I was only a student, he knew my name, and he initiated conversations with me. I felt like one of the disciples chosen by Jesus himself. He was smart, smooth, and attractive. He was our assurance whenever people sneered that Christians were socially or intellectually inferior. And he was deeply spiritual. He literally wrote best-selling books about ordering your private world and the life God blesses. In those early days, I didn't really follow Jesus. I didn't even know what that meant, but I didn't need to. I followed our rock star pastor. He was who I wanted to be. So you can imagine how I felt a few years later when it was revealed that he'd been hiding an affair. I remember right where I was when I heard the news, on a weekend retreat. And I wandered into the woods by myself, reeling from the shock and disillusionment. I mean, his doctrine was orthodox. His preaching was powerful. He was the pastor that other pastors went to for advice. But no one knew what was going on the inside, where his private world, including his emotions and relationships, were awash in anger and insecurity, lust and deception. I was devastated. My body returned home after that retreat, but my spirit stayed behind, lost in that wilderness for months, unsure what I could believe in anymore. Was any of this talk about Jesus' transforming power even real? Eventually, I found my way out, but many people close to me never made it back from that wilderness. And that scared me, because I knew that his gifts and mine, his personality and mine, his brokenness and mine were very similar. I became afraid of myself, aware of just how much people like me can hurt people. So 35 years ago, as I entered ministry, I vowed to never let there be a gap between what I present on the outside and what's real on the inside. At the time, that seemed easy. But now, as the senior pastor of this church, I see how much easier it is to settle for admiration from people than transformation from God. It's easier to tell people what Jesus said than listen to what Jesus is saying to me. It's easier to write a sermon than to deal with whatever isn't right in my own life. Because honesty, apologies, and change are all painful. It's easier to pretend to be spiritual, and I've done that too many times. And I've seen many of you do it too. People who've been Christians for years, leading Bible studies, volunteering in ministry, who appear so spiritually mature and yet have gaping holes in their growth. Places in their past, their relationships, emotions, money, or integrity that the Holy Spirit hasn't been given access to. Deep places where fear and sin still control them. It's the person you refuse to forgive, or the conversation you refuse to have. The sin you think is unforgivable or irresistible. It's the generosity you can't give, or the demand you can't give up. The wound from the past that you let fester instead of doing the more painful work needed for healing. That insecurity that no degree or achievement can erase. That hot button topic that even if brushed lightly arouses your rage or your tears. It's the way your voice rises and your muscles tense whenever you talk about your family or your finances, the state of our nation. Is that you? Sometimes it's me. And when I see that, I'm seized by the fear that I'm becoming like my previous pastor, becoming what Jesus called an actor, who pretends to be more healthy or holy than I am, to garner applause from other people. The ancient word he used for actor was upokrates, in English, hypocrite. One of my deepest fears is being a hypocrite, and yet sometimes that's what I am. I don't want to be, but sometimes my anger, sloth, greed, or insecurity get the best of me, and I betray my deepest desires. So the goal of this series is to help you and me expose the spiritual sounding techniques that we use to hide what's inside us, but which keep us from experiencing or extending real forgiveness, real joy, real peace, and real love. This tendency to lie and hide, it's as old as the Bible itself. We see it when Adam and Eve hid from God and each other in the Garden of Eden, not wanting their shame to be seen and refusing to confess their disobedience. We see it in the religious leaders in Jesus' day, whom he accused of being whitewashed tombs, trying to look pretty on the outside to hide the death and rot on the inside. We see it in our political leaders, and religious leaders. We see it in ourselves. And we saw it in Saul, in the story that we read earlier from 1 Samuel 15. To appreciate this story, you need to know that Saul was anointed by God as the first king of Israel. He'd experienced God's blessings, and he seemed like the definition of success. And yet he ended up failing tragically because his private life, including his emotions and spiritual life, were a mess. In this story, God's using Israel's army to bring an end to the perpetual injustice perpetrated by the Amalekites. Now, today, we're justifiably alarmed by God's command to exterminate another nation, and we should be. So it's good if you have some questions about the context. I've addressed that in the past, and I will again, to be sure. But for today, I want to focus on the sickness inside Saul's soul that turned out to be a far bigger threat than any foreign army. In verse 3, the Lord specifically commanded that the Amalekites and everything that belonged to them must be destroyed, both in order to prevent the possibility of Israel having mixed motives for this mission, and even more, because the Amalekites' culture was so unusually cruel that God wanted to prevent their influence from spreading. So the Israelites were prohibited from taking any plunder of gold or livestock. Everything had to be destroyed. So Saul's army invaded, as instructed, and obliterated the Amalekites. Mostly. Verse 9. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely. But everything that was despised and weak, they totally destroyed. Leaving God lamenting to Samuel, I regret that I made Saul king because he's turned away from me and he's not carried out my instructions. Saul's greed got the best of him. But I bet he thought he was doing the right thing. I mean, why kill King Agag? He could be a useful political tool. And why waste perfectly good sheep and cattle? I mean, that's not good stewardship. Surely God wouldn't want that. Over the decades as a Christian, I've done similar things. I've thought I knew better than God what was good, or at least what was good for me. So I've disobeyed God's clear instructions while convincing myself I was doing the right thing. And I know I'm not alone, because over my decades as pastor, I've heard many of you make similar spiritual-sounding justifications for your sin. People telling me why they should sleep with their boyfriend or leave their spouse or sell out their convictions to make more money or withhold forgiveness and withhold God's tithe. Fudge the truth in order to ensure the good outcome they're sure God wants. And we may convince everyone, including ourselves, that it's not sin. It's just being smart, smarter than God, it seems. But every time we do that, God's Spirit is squeezed out of one more part of our lives. That's what Saul was doing. He deluded himself that he was doing the right thing, that he was some kind of spiritual hero. So when the prophet Samuel arrived, Saul announced proudly, "I've carried out the Lord's instructions," prompting Samuel to ask ruefully, "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear?" Saul stammered, refusing to take responsibility. "The soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and the cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we totally destroyed the rest." To sacrifice. You see how he makes disobedience and greed seem so holy? Exasperated, Samuel asked, "Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord?" "But I did obey," Saul insisted, trying to keep up the act. I completely destroyed the Amalekites. I brought back Agag, their king. The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder. There he goes again, placing blame on anyone but himself. But Samuel replied, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. Self-righteous Saul had convinced himself that he was so faithful when he was further from God than ever. We all do that sometimes. We sin while convincing ourselves of our virtue and blaming everybody else. We insist, I would love and serve and forgive and give generously, but my spouse or kids or parents, they're impossible. My schedule is crazy. The economy, it's so uncertain. I'm so tired. No one could love someone like that. We have plenty of excuses for ignoring God's instructions, enough to truly convince ourselves. But usually other people can see right through them, like Samuel did with Saul. And when confronted, Saul responded in a way that seemed so spiritual. He admits, I've sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the men, so I gave in to them. Saul's a people pleaser, just like me. Now, I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord. That sounds so humble on the surface. But soon Saul's deeper motive becomes clear. I've sinned, but please, honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel. Come back with me so that I may worship the Lord your God. Saul wanted to make sure that no one would see his secret sin. So he asked Samuel to help him keep it hidden by publicly honoring him as a godly leader. He didn't want transformation deep inside. He wanted to be liked and look good on the surface. My pastor did that. Sometimes I do that. Like Saul, I don't lie. I just don't tell the whole story, but only the parts that make me look good. Do you ever do that? A lot of Christians do that. Knowing the Greek words for love is not the same as loving. Quoting Bible verses about forgiveness is not the same as forgiving. The truth we see in Saul is that we can't be spiritually mature without becoming emotionally mature. For example, he seems unaware of his own motives, including how controlled he is by his need for approval from other people. That keeps him from following God the way I suspect he sincerely wants to, but doesn't. I see this same thing in so many earnest Highrockers who want to learn more about God so they can have a deeper relationship with him. But often I find that the problem isn't that we don't know God enough, it's that we don't know ourselves enough to have an honest conversation with God. We've been so distracted with work or school, raising kids, scrolling on social media, or perfecting our brand that, like Saul, we don't even know our true motives. We're angry, hurt, or insecure, but we don't really know why. We blame other people because it's too painful to explore what's in our own souls. But we can't discuss those things with God if we haven't gone deep enough to see them ourselves. So one goal of this series is to help you see some of the emotions, assumptions, and patterns that are keeping you stuck, so that with God's help, you can receive forgiveness and break free. Another example of Saul's shallow spirituality is the way he uses religion to avoid a relationship with God. He makes impressive sacrifices, but Samuel asks, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? In Hebrew, the word translated obey here literally means to listen. In prayer, we so often talk at God, but are we open to hearing God speak to the deepest parts of our desires and anxieties? Are we willing to talk honestly about the secret sins that we don't want to give up? One of my pastor friends told me about a time he was leading a Bible study and noticed that one participant kept writing names in the margin of his Bible. When the pastor finally asked what he was doing, he explained that he was writing the names of the people who needed to hear that verse. Notably, his name was never there. It's easier to not listen. So often when people go out to lunch after service, an opening question is, "So, what'd you think of the sermon?" I remember doing that so often in college, analyzing the tone and rhetorical technique of the speaker rather than asking what God was saying to me. I didn't let God's word penetrate any deeper than my intellect, because talking about my temper, my lust, or my fear felt too risky. We can also use religion to hide from other people, hide from the kinds of honest conflicts and conversations that could lead to real healing. I remember one woman in college who never spoke to me. She was always reading her Bible and constantly at prayer meetings, and I just assumed that she was too spiritually advanced to interact with a brand new Christian dweeb like me. But later I learned that she was so insecure that she was afraid to be real with people. She read her Bible constantly as an excuse to hide. And she only spoke up at prayer meetings because it was the one place she learned the right things to say. Other people use prayer gatherings to wallow in their anxieties, impress others, or criticize others under the guise of speaking to God. Emotional unhealth can look so holy. You know, when we start to recognize all this, it can sound almost hopeless. We're no better than Saul, so what hope is there for us? Actually, a lot. Because Saul's successor, King David, was a sinner every bit as much as Saul was, or any of us are. And yet God calls him a man after my own heart. Huh? What was the difference? And by many standards, David did worse things than Saul. The difference is that David listened. David repented of his sin. David learned from the past and from his pain. David was in a relationship with God. David was real. David prayed, "Search me, God, know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me and lead me in the way everlasting." David was asking the hard questions and listening. Many of the Psalms are David's prayers of confession. David wasn't perfect, but he was honest. David knew that he was valuable and that he was fallible, both. So David received God's forgiveness, and David was changed. Proverbs 20 asks, "Who can say, 'I've kept my heart pure, I'm clean and without sin'?" You know who said that? Saul. But David wouldn't. And I can't. We can't. If we're going to be truly healed by God's Spirit in the deepest parts, then we need to give up the act pretending that we don't need God's help or forgiveness. Because when we're real about who we are and what's inside us, Jesus can heal. This is what emotionally healthy spirituality is all about. It's not that we need less of God's forgiveness and transforming power. It's that we're able to find the forgiveness and power that we need. One of the blessings of being a pastor at the same church for so long is that I've seen that happen countless times right here in this congregation. People who'd been unsafe and hot-headed becoming compassionate and humble. People who were insecure and anxious becoming confident and free. People learning to extend and receive forgiveness. People throwing off the shackles of long-standing sin or no longer listening to the lies that have been plaguing them since childhood. I've seen marriages on the brink of divorce transformed. I've seen some of you change in amazing ways. And I've learned to never give up on anyone, not even on myself. Just last week, my own wife commented about a way that she'd seen me grow this year and how that had affected our entire family. I was just more relaxed and able to laugh at myself. What was even better is that I knew it was true. I'd seen it myself. After following Jesus for decades, he's still changing me. God isn't done with me yet, and he's not done with you. Friends, I want to see you set free to love and live to the full. So for the next 7 weeks, we're going to expose some of the common barriers that keep us from being all that God designed us to be and loving the way that we see Jesus doing. Whether you've been a Christian for decades or still just figuring all this out, this is an opportunity for us to meet God in a new way and be changed. Maybe this week, you can start by paying more attention to what you're feeling and why. Take note not only of your emotions, but your motives. Be suspicious of the stories you tell yourself. Notice the ways we're tempted to pretend, like Saul, so that we don't end up like Saul. Instead, use David's prayer from Psalm 139 each day to invite God into that conversation and listen to whatever the Spirit might say. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me and lead me in the way everlasting. My prayer is that God will speak to you during this series and that together we'll dive deeper into our own souls and deeper into God's grace than we've ever been before. Lord, make it so.